Hello, my name is Bobby, and in this video I'm going to be showing you the Managed API, a powerful feature for ScriptRunner Connect. ScriptRunner Connect is our cloud-based integration platform that gives you the ability to write code to create unique and powerful integrations and connections between the tools in your software ecosystem. Because this requires writing code, we're going to be interacting with the APIs of the tools we want to integrate with. For anyone who's written code for APIs, you'll know that it is almost mandatory to have the documentation open on another tab or another window so you can verify what the API is expecting in terms of package structure, what it sends back, what was mandatory when you send a query, etc. With the Managed API, we've removed the need for this and built it all into the editor itself so that you don't need to look at any other screens to build your API call. So how do we use it? So as you can see, I'm in a workspace view here. In this workspace, I've got my script and I've got 3 APIs that I've defined a connection to. So I'm telling my workspace that I'm going to be communicating with Jira Cloud, with Microsoft, and with ServiceNow. To bring the Managed API into this script, what I need to do is select the option at the top here to import API connection. I choose the connection that I want to import and I give it a name. So the default name will be Jira Cloud, and I import it. Now this imports the API connection under the variable name Jira Cloud, which means that I can now go and type Jira Cloud at any given point in time, and now I have full access to the Managed API. The API endpoints are divided into subsections. So for example, if I wanted to create an issue, I would type issue.create issue. So once I've done that, and I now open up the brackets, we can see that the editor automatically pops up information, which is a description of the API endpoint we're currently using, as well as at the bottom, a link to the official documentation if at any point you do need to review. But that's not always necessary. As you can see, we're getting an error here in the editor. We know what this API requires, so we can tell you what you need to add. So you can see here, I'm missing the definition of a body in the issue create request. What I also have available to me in the editor is Control and Space as a keyboard shortcut, which gives me contextual suggestions based upon where my cursor is currently located. So for example, if I was to go outside of these brackets and Control and Space, I get almost everything. However, if I'm inside the function, if I do Control and Space, I get suggestions on what I can and should be entering at this point in time. So let's define the body, Control and Space, let's define the fields, Control and Space. These are the fields I can define. Now for anyone who uses Jira Cloud, you'll know that there are 3 things you need to create or define for an issue creation, which is the issue type, the project, and the summary. So let's define those. At any point in time, we can see that the item that we're looking at, so for example, the issue type is an object. So define that, Control and Space, we'll define their name, and we'll just leave it blank for now. Next, project is the same, key, and finally summary, which is just a string. And that is now a valid API call. What it is doing, the first section is the authentication. So this is your connector that you created earlier, and we are handling the authentication using that. So by creating the connector and storing your authentication in ScriptRunner Connect, you can then reference that connector here under API connections, which is then linked to this variable Jira Cloud, which can then be referenced in the code, which then handles that authentication for you. We don't have to worry about the method or headers. It's all handled by the Managed API. We just have to worry about the data structure that we're sending. You can store the response in a variable. And it is important to note that these API calls are asynchronous, which means that if you were to run this as is, the script would continue to execute before it got a response back from Jira. So to demonstrate this, if I was to console log out the response, and hover over it, we can see that it's currently considered to be a promise. What this is essentially saying is, I don't know what's going to be held in here because we're not waiting for the API call to come back, so I can't tell you. What we can do is add an await. And now if I look at the response, it's the correct type. It's no longer a promise, because what this basically says is stop here until we get a response back from Jira before continuing the execution of this script. And as mentioned, not only when using an API is the consideration, what do I send to that endpoint, but the consideration is also, what do I get back? What's that structure? This is also handled by the managed API. So now if I go to response dot, I have access to the information about the issue that was created. So I can say issue key. So let's just see this working. Let's put this into the console log. And let's fill this API call out with correct information. So story, and the project is going to be, the key is going to be web. When I go to execute the script now, it's going to make that API call, and it's going to log out the key of the issue that's created, web 100. Now, obviously Jira, you may be watching this video and you're not either using Jira or you're interested about other tools. We have managed APIs for every tool that we have a managed connection for. So if I go to add a new connector, you can see here any logo you see is a tool that we support a managed API for. Now, some tools don't have a full managed API. So a common example for this is Microsoft. We added support for Microsoft Teams. However, Microsoft Teams does not have a REST API. Microsoft as a suite has a REST API. So what we do is we have managed API for the Teams functionality, but not for any other particular API endpoints. So if I was to import my Microsoft connector and go and we'll do the same thing, Microsoft dot, you can see here that there are some endpoints available to us, subsections, but the primary one is Teams and the ability to access Teams related APIs. However, you don't have to use our predefined functions. So for example, if I wanted to access Microsoft Excel endpoints, for example, I still can using the credentials under the Microsoft keyword. All I need to do is a fetch. Fetch is a base level API call that allows you, that does take you back to using the structure that I've defined before, understanding the API, what it's required, etc., but gives you that ability to communicate with any API endpoint. So here I can define the endpoint, and then here I can define the additional functionality. So headers method being get, headers being a object, and then the body being a string. Now, one thing to note when you're doing a fetch call, if you're sending a JSON body, it needs to be a string. So you would structure this in JSON dot stringify, open those brackets, and then you can define your JSON as you would normally. One last thing to also mention is that the API calls in this circumstance are not automatically processed. So in this circumstance, if I just, let's call this one response 2. To get the body of the response, I can't just say response 2.body. What I have to have is .json. This gets the processed JSON from that response. So it would be const processed response equals await response 2.json. So to summarize, the managed API makes writing API calls super simple. When it comes to creating coded integrations between your software, the most complication does come from the APIs in terms of what they can do, how to structure them, etc. So what we've done is built the managed APIs to remove that complexity. So you just have to worry about your business logic. If, then, else. And for the API calls, it's much easier, much quicker and faster to not only write them, but also maintain them, because this is a much easier thing to read than a full API call. However, we have the additional flexibility for you to be able to make any API call, either with a tool that we do have a managed connection for, but not covering every single API endpoint, or if you end up using the generic connector, which allows you to connect to any tool, you can go and make a base level API call with a little bit of additional processing. You can still make those API calls, get that data processed. It won't be structured at the beginning or when it comes back. However, you can still do that. That's been the managed APIs. Look forward to seeing what you create with them. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great rest of the day.